Welcome back, everyone. We're back here with Jay Tharappel, and Jay's work can be found on the orientaldespot.com.
That's right.
So last time we had Jay on the podcast, we spoke about the Yemen conflict and whether it was a conflict or a humanitarian crisis. Today, we're looking at another conflict. Unfortunately, there's too many going on in the world right now, and they must be looked into. So today, we're looking more into the Syrian conflict. So Jay, thank you very much for joining us again. I just want you to give us a bit of a background on the Syrian conflict. How did it originate and why?
The war in Syria fundamentally is driven by the attempt to overthrow the state, not the state resisting those attempts. And those attempts on the ground have been dominated by Al-Qaeda and Islamic State and other similar such organizations, namely Ahrar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, although they're more nationally focused. And these groups have the backing, either covertly or overtly, of Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United States, Britain, and by extension the European Union and NATO. And this is what's driving the conflict.
And is this conflict, can it be explained as a sectarian conflict, or is it more outside powers looking to be involved in Syria?
It can be seen as a sectarian conflict in the sense that if you treat sect as a geopolitical marker and identifier, then yes, I mean, Iranian interests will be expressed in terms of Shia Islamic ideology. And what's new, I think, is that Turkey, as relatively new over the past 20 years, Turkey has taken on a more Islamic identity for itself. Neo-Ottomanism is what it's called. And it's rejected the old secular Turkish nationalist ideology that they used to have. And on top of that, we know that Saudi Arabia represents Wahhabism in the region. And so when you put those multiple factors together, you realize, yeah, there is like obviously a sectarian angle in terms of the geopolitics, in terms of the broader affiliations. But in terms of Syrian society, which I think is very important and often missed, the defections from the Syrian army, which is what the so-called Syrian revolution was hoping for, were actually very, very small. And if you look at the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is an anti-Syrian government source, even according to them, something like 49 to 70% of the dead among the insurgency, that is the forces waging war against the Syrian state, have been foreigners, which suggests that the Sunni rebellion that they were hoping for didn't happen. Indeed, the majority of the Syrian army is Sunni. So within Syria, I think you see a lot more pluralistic, multi-faith cooperation to defend their country.
So it's basically more of a national resistance rather than a Shia or Sunni or Christian or whatever faith they follow resistance.
Look, I think Syria does not get enough credit. I know that sounds like a difficult claim to make given all of the propaganda that's been thrown at Syria, but this is a country that prior to the war had among the highest life expectancies in the Arab world. It had free healthcare, it had free education. It was a welfare state. It was, I mean, obviously every country's got problems, right? But dwelling on those problems to the extent that you ignore the social successes of the Syrian government, I think is wrong. And when it came to the relationship between the different sect groups in Syria, I think the Ba'ath Party presided over an era of peace, stability, and harmony that historically wasn't there, especially for minorities.
So do you think that the success of the Syrian government prior to the conflict was the reason that these countries came in and used the same like reason or agenda that we want to bring in democracy into the nation? Or was it more that we want to come and take your resources and take over you?
I think we can identify multiple interests driving the war against Syria. So like that's the fundamental assumption, that this war is being driven by the attempt to overthrow the Syrian state, not the Syrian state resisting those attempts. Yep. Very important premise. And if anyone can challenge that premise, please come and talk to me, and ask me anything, of course. But so if we look at the attempt to overthrow the Syrian state and who's driving it, the United States, I would argue, ever since the 1970s, has been driven by these attempts to uphold its own hegemony.
Yep.
What does this mean? I mean, ever since 1971, when the United States went off the gold standard, it's had to back its currency with something, which is when, in 1975-76, it created a deal with the OPEC states to price oil in dollars, and this would create an artificial demand for US dollars. But over time, this has started to degenerate. So to give you an example of this from my research, back in 1980, 55% of all of the capital that was exported in the world. So if you take like net capital exports, 55% of all the capital that was exported in the world was exported by the United States. Now it's 55% in the other way, in the other direction. The United States imports 55% of the world's capital. What does that mean? The United States relies on loans from the rest of the world to keep its economy going. I remember I was listening to a former IMF economist, and he now works for the Brookings Institute. His name's Iswar Prasad, and he basically said that that instability around the world creates this rush to hold US dollars. Now, he didn't imply anything malicious by it, but think about that. If you create instability in other parts of the world, it causes the US dollar to strengthen, right? And he referred to the fact that many countries had to buy US dollars or sought refuge in the US dollar as them buying protection money. Now, protection money, for anyone who doesn't know, is a euphemism for extortion, especially when you're dealing with organized crime and talking about their activities.
So with this, let's look at that extortion that the United States is using.
We'll get to the other countries as well, but we'll get to the extortion.
Definitely. So earlier you mentioned the few countries that are involved. So either the United States, some Gulf states, UK or Britain. And last time we spoke about the Yemen conflict, you mentioned the same nations. So it feels like this is a recurring theme. Is this what the United States is hoping to achieve in extorting these poorer nations like Yemen and Syria to build their own economy? And like you said, it depends on people taking loans from them.
Yeah, it's about the region more so than just hitting Syria, although that certainly helps. So the United States, ever since it established its hegemony after 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, it's had this geostrategy, and the general geostrategy is that they have to contain Eurasia, because they have this theory which says the world is divided fundamentally into two geographic zones. You've got the heartland, which is basically Russia, but also China. And then you've got the rimland, which is all of the territories that surround the heartland. And so the soft underbelly of the heartland is the Middle East. The United States was ejected from the eastern part of the Eurasian heartland when they lost the wars in Vietnam. North Korea put up a good fight, so that ended in a bloody stalemate, and they're being politically outmaneuvered in the Korean context. And so the Middle East becomes a very important region of contestation, right? So one, you've got the oil-producing states that pump out oil in exchange for US dollars. That's very important. Two, you've got a counter-hegemonic power like Iran, which wants to become a nuclear power. Okay? Now, from the American perspective, what does this mean? If Iran develops nuclear energy, it's going to free up a lot of their oil for export to the rest of the world. And Israel is afraid of that because it means that Iran will have a much larger budget to support the Palestinians in their struggle, in their just struggle. So on top of that, you've also got the fact that I think I already mentioned that the US dollar has been in decline for a while now. And so imagine a situation in which the United States didn't intervene in Eurasia. What would happen? The Eurasian powers, so the Eurozone, Russia, China, these countries would start to economically integrate with each other. They build infrastructure, they build railways, they cooperate on telecommunications. Iran would start selling more oil to China and Russia in their own currencies, which is happening, by the way.
So essentially, the US is afraid of an alliance between these countries.
They talk about it. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is one of the very important geostrategic thinkers for the United States, he wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard, in which he said, we have to prevent the emergence of an anti-hegemonic coalition. And he specifically mentioned Russia, China, and Iran.
So is this part of the US agenda, that we have to break up all these connections between these nations like Russia, China, Iran, and work with Israel, work with the Gulf nations that we have under our wing to destroy this alliance that might be growing?
Yeah. And if you want to look at Israel, I mean, it's just so blatant. Back in 1982, there's a document. It's called the Oded Yinon document. And this document, it's very interesting. It says, the dissolution of Syria and Iraq into ethnically or religiously unique areas is Israel's primary target. Syria will fall apart in accordance with its ethnic and religious structure. There will be a Shia Alawi state, a Sunni state in Aleppo, another Sunni state in Damascus, which is hostile to its northern neighbor, so Sunni versus Sunni. That's what they were planning originally. And the Druze, who will set up a state maybe even in our Golan. So they totally wanted to divide up Syria back in 1982.
So they had this plan. Had it started in 1982, or was this a goal for the future? And like, this is what we want to achieve, and it's going to take us a few years, but we're going to work closely with countries like the US.
Yeah, well, I think it takes a lot of convincing. So it's like the Israelis have expanded their influence within the US government since 1982. So sometimes it's difficult to know where the agency is coming from. So there are some people in the United States who believe that the United States is purely being used by Israel to fight its wars. I don't fully agree. I think there's overlapping agency because a lot of Israelis also have dual passports, so they're Americans as well.
Yeah.
So, you know, whose agency is dominant here? Is it the United States or is it Israel? The traditional view on the left is that the United States controls Israel and the United States and Israel is subordinate to the United States. But the view among the right and a lot of the dissident right in the United States is the other way around.
Yeah.
That, you know, they're being taken for a ride, that they're being, told to fight and die for Israel and Israel's interests only.
So you mentioned dual citizenships.
Yeah.
For Israelis, they have American and Israeli passports. Is that because of the Zionist movement that originated in America, or is it because they had lived in Israel and moved into America to begin their influence there?
I just think it's because Israel is a nation of people who fly often. You know? So they might spend some time in Israel, then they go to the United States. To become a citizen of Israel, you just have to be Jewish. That's it. You don't need any historic connection to that land. All you have to say is, all you have to say is I'm Jewish, and therefore the assumption is your ancestors, or at least a percentage of your ancestors, lived there 2,000 years ago.
So if you look at, I know we're going off topic a bit, but I think it's very related to the Syrian conflict.
The best conversations happen that way.
So you mentioned earlier that the Palestinian struggle is a just struggle.
Yeah.
Is that because the colonization and the annexation of the Palestinian lands by Israel, or is it to do more with the religious struggle?
No, it's got nothing to do with religion for me. I think that it's universal that anyone in the world, if they saw a large influx of refugees, immigrants coming to their country, that might piss them off. But if those refugees then within the space of a few years decide to carve out a separate state and carve it off from the rest of the region, because what is Palestine? Palestine is inextricably connected to the rest of the Arabic-speaking region, specifically in the Levant. So people in Syria have a historic memory. People in Lebanon, Jordan, have the same memory of a time when they would be able to travel to Jerusalem and back without having a passport, without needing a passport. Can we imagine if the same thing happened in Sydney, where a part of Sydney was just suddenly cordoned off and you can't go there anymore? I wouldn't accept that. And so for the same reason, I don't think anyone in the world should expect the Palestinians to accept that, which is why, I'll end on this note, my position on Israel-Palestine is exactly the same as the position of the first Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. You know what he said?
What did he say?
I can't believe he said this. Because this is the thing, you have to appreciate the honesty sometimes. He said, if I were an Arab leader, I would never make an agreement with Israel It is normal. We have come and we have taken their country. Why should they accept that? What more do you need?
So if you look at this from a citizen's perspective, the first Israeli Prime Minister says this. How would you, as Jay, respond to this as a Palestinian and as a so-called Israeli?
Oh, if they said that, well, I just look at it as vindication. Well, this person is just being brutally honest. That's the way I'd see it.
What was his end?
I don't know about what happened to David Ben Gurion. I believe he died peacefully. Yeah.
Back to the Syrian conflict.
To Israel,
it's all related. All these conflicts are very related, and Israel is at the heart of most of this, causing the sectarian violence. So looking at that sectarian violence that was being pushed by these nations, how were they able to achieve a civil war between the Shia and the Sunni in nations like Syria?
Yeah, I see where that's coming from. Well, like I said before, when we talk about the Syrian Arab army, we're talking about a multi-sect army. But the way they did that is really insidious, because it's something that they've been working on for a while. And I think to really give this question justice, if you don't mind, we should go into the invasion of Iraq.
Definitely.
Let's make that the starting point. So the United States invades Iraq. They were expecting to be able to topple Saddam Hussein, who, whatever you may think of him, was not an American puppet. I mean, he collaborated with the United States. The United States helped him against Iran. That's like one way of putting it. But putting all of that aside, I mean, after 1991, the United States was happy to have weakened Iraq. But in 2003, they decided to knock out his government. They thought that they'd be able to replace it with a compliant government that would basically just follow the orders of Washington. And this is where the Iraqi resistance comes into it. Because there's two... At the time, I remember in 2003, 2004, there was a lot of anger, particularly at Sayyid Sistani.
Yep.
Sayyid Ali Sistani, where they said, why isn't he calling for a jihad against the occupier? But in a sense, Sistani's jihad was a lot more effective, because he argued that a constitution for Iraq could not be imposed by the United States, because that's what they tried to do. They tried to impose their own constitution. He said, this is illegitimate. A constitution can only be introduced by a freely elected Iraqi government. And so they marched, they protested. There's a great article written about this by Seth Ackerman, and I read it way back then in 2005, I think, and it's called Defeated by Democracy. And so the argument here is that the United States, they lost the war in Iraq when they had to make that political concession, because they themselves invaded Iraq saying, we're going to bring democracy. This tyrannical regime, we're going to get rid of it. We're going to give democracy to the people there. Now, I think the naive elements in the US administration thought that the Democrats would be pro-US. They weren't. They were pro-Iran. And why wouldn't they be? I mean, Iran is their neighbor.
Yeah.
And the outcome ultimately was an Iraqi state that represented independent interests. So, for example, Nouri al-Maliki, whatever you think about him, when it came to putting Iraq's energy resources up for investment bids, a lot of the contracts went to Russia and China. Now, that takes courage.
Definitely.
Okay? That takes a lot of courage. Your country is occupied by a country that has a history of assassinating leaders, right? Left, right, and center. They've just done it over and over again, launched coups to overthrow democratically elected governments over and over again. They're occupying your country, and when it comes to signing contracts, you give it to the Russians and the Chinese.
Yeah,
that's courageous. It's not something.
Was that? Sorry to interrupt. Was that an early push for oil for US dollars?
Well, the thing is, Iraq remained hooked on US dollars. I mean, there are some compromises here, So Iraq got back on the US dollar after that. I mean, I think I'm not too sure about that actually. So what I remember is that, actually now I've forgotten. This is something that I used to know that I've forgotten, so I'm not going to speak on it. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is that with the 2005 elections, because you mentioned, and I promise that I'm going to get to the question of sectarianism because that's how this started, the Sunni versus Shia sectarianism. What happened immediately after the 2005 elections? Do you remember Abu Musa al-Zarqawi?
Yes.
Now, he basically issued a fatwa where he called for an all-out war against the Shia. Not just that, I think he made a video which is like 2 hours long or something where he went through all of the fatwas in the history of that region against the Shia, calling either for their persecution, proclaiming takfir against them, or even calling for them to be killed. So one of the famous sayings that comes out of this, which was really popularized during the Syrian conflict, is that the Shia are more disbelieving than the Christians and the Jews.
So why was that popularized?
It was popularized because I think you read about this in The Redirection. This is an article written by Seymour Hersh. It came out in 2007, where he said there's basically a shift in the US geostrategy when it comes to Iraq, because the democracy that came to power is contrary to US interests, as I mentioned. It's independent, it's too friendly to Iran, and so there has to be a plan B. What is that plan B? And this is where the Balkanization of Iraq becomes a really important objective. And this is where I think Israeli geostrategy starts to come to the assistance of the United States. So check this out. Iraq, this is, okay, I'll introduce this document, 1982. I think I already mentioned it before. That's right, yeah. I was thinking about the other document too. Iraq, rich in oil on the one hand and internally torn on the other, is guaranteed as a candidate for Israel's targets. Every kind of inter-Arab confrontation will assist us in the short run and will shorten the way to the more important aim of breaking up Iraq into denominations as in Syria and in Lebanon. This is what the Israelis are saying in 1982. You can't accuse them of not thinking ahead. So they basically started to use Sunni identity against the Shia identity, basically saying the Iranians are taking over Iraq, the Shia are taking over Iraq, all of the Sunnis in the world should come to Iraq to try and stem this tide. So essentially the United States was undermining the very government that they were formerly in a relationship with. So this tells you something about the deep state and the shallow state. The shallow state is like holding press conferences with Nouri al-Maliki and shaking hands with Iraqi government officials. But the deep state is working with the Saudis to undermine the Iraqi government. And so Saudi Arabia starts pumping money into groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And that's when the wave of suicide bombings from 2006 to 2007 happened in the context of the American political loss in the 2005 elections the year before.
So this document was the precursor for the sectarian violence that was introduced by the US and Saudi Arabia.
I think so. I mean, I don't know when it came out. I think it came out like in the 2000s. It was like pretty much held secret up until then. But yeah, it talks about what Israel's long-term strategy is for the region, because Israel wants to divide these states into denominational sectarian states, because then it makes their country look normal.
Yeah,
it's like, well, we're the Jewish state, this is the Sunni state, this is the Druze state, this is the Alawite state, etc., etc., etc.
So was this notion of drawing out these borders introduced to the Israelis or the Jews, because they weren't Israelis before, by the British?
No, this is 1982, so this is like Israel doing it.
No, so yeah. I'm saying this idea of drawing these borders, was this introduced to the Jews before they became a state?
I don't know. I don't think there's any evidence for that. I mean, I think it's just a step-by-step process. So if you don't have control of Palestine, then you're going to try and gain control and establish a state. Once you've done that, you realize there's hostility against you. There's three powerful Arab states, namely Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. Egypt was the most powerful at that time. Yeah. Then, unfortunately, after the death of Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt made peace with Israel. By the way, Gamal Abdel Nasser is a very important argument why you should not smoke, right? The guy was a pack-a-day smoker, right? And had he lived another 20 years, who knows? He died at the age of 50. The Arab world could have been very different. But yeah, I think really this starts to appear in the 1980s, where they think we have to have a strategy for balkanizing these other countries around us. So instead of just like fighting the Palestinians within our borders. Let's make this an external war.
So they were pushing for a proxy war because they didn't want to fight in their own, or it wasn't their land, but the Palestinian land.
I think it's evident. I mean, you know, I think after the no, I do know about this. After the 2006 war in Lebanon, where Israel got a very rude shock from the Lebanese resistance. I mean, that was a shock to the entire world.
Definitely.
And the thing is, you know, if Hezbollah's status in the Muslim world, Sunni and Shia, was very high after that. A lot of people respected them because Israel used to think of itself as just invincible, you know, that they had defeated the Arabs in 6 days. Surely
they were the most powerful army in the world.
Because what happened in 1982? They invaded South Lebanon. Back then, it wasn't controlled by Hezbollah, it was controlled by the PLO.
Yep.
And they made short work of them. It was not a difficult war for them at all. It was, okay, look, I mean, they lost some casualties. It's not like it was completely easy.
Yep.
But the fact is that within the space of a year, they occupied, I mean, less than a year, occupied Lebanon, and they had entered Beirut. Right? And they were like laying siege to it, which is what resulted in the Sabra Shatila massacre. Here's now in 2006, they try and enter the country, and all of a sudden they're facing resistance and they have to move. They have to leave. And so they ended up resorting to, like, you know, bombing, just Shia areas in general, you know, to just punish the population. But that was a rude shock to them. And I think the lesson that they drew was that the invasion of Iraq was fundamentally counterproductive, because think about what happened, right? Before the invasion of Iraq was hostile to Iran, although their relationship was like easing and was becoming better, right? Because after you go to war for that long, you know, you realize that you have a common enemy in terms of the United States. The relationship was improving, but nonetheless, they weren't cooperating. They were still hostile. And so what happened is that a country that was historically I think it's more accurate to say a government in Iraq that was hostile to Iran is removed, and you end up having a government that's pro-Iran, friendly to Iran, wants good relations with Iran. So this creates a land bridge. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. And so the Israelis blame this on why they lost. Because, you know, Hezbollah all of a sudden has all of these sophisticated means of defending their territory, defending Lebanese territory. Not that they get credit.
Yeah, definitely. So do you think that counterproductive invasion of the US basically formed a strong resistance? Basically, it not on purpose, but it formed this resistance from Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Lebanon to combine all together against countries like Israel and the US.
And to make matters even worse, in 2007, in the Persian Gulf, they discovered large quantities of natural gas. And so this was split between Qatar and Iran. So Iran wanted to build what they call the Islamic pipeline, and this would traverse its own territory in the south, in the Pars region, into Iraq, then to Syria, and then it would end in Lebanon, either Lebanon or the Mediterranean coast that Syria has. And yeah, I mean, this is a huge competitive challenge because it solidifies the alliance of these countries. Because what happens is if you have countries that have a common interest in energy cooperation, they tend to become friends.
Definitely.
It's against their interest to become enemies. And so this is a huge threat.
So now that these nations have aligned together for a common interest and against a common enemy, why is it that Syria was chosen as the source of the war, or the initial place of the war?
To quote IDF military chief Gadi Eisenkot in 2019, "We identified Syria as the weak link where we could cut the Shiite crescent." They thought 65 to 70% of the population is Sunni. Turkey is Sunni. They will redirect their loyalties towards Erdogan, and they won't be loyal to an Alawite president. Surely not. They were wrong.
So would you label the war in Syria as a civil war, as it's been described in mainstream media?
It has civil war aspects to it, insofar as, there are Syrians who have killed other Syrians. But like I mentioned before, even according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, 70% of the dead among the insurgency fighting the Syrian government are foreigners. Okay, sorry, 49 to 70%, because you've got a minimal and a maximal estimate. I've got the data up. I'll have to upload it because it's all on Excel. So there is a civil war element to it. I mean, there are certainly Syrians in Idlib and Daraa in particular who took up arms against the government. But the problem is that, you know, this is such a closed perspective because it ignores the external pressures against Syria. Because if you have external pressure, funding, and inflows of fighters to fight against any government, it's going to magnify the ability to overthrow the government, and it's going to be externally fueled. Now, the way that like a genuine revolution is supposed to happen, it's supposed to happen in the Yemeni way, right? What happened in Yemen? It's like the army literally defected to the side of the revolution.
Yep.
The army said, these people represent the national interests. This government we don't trust because they're representing the interests of foreign powers. We're going to redirect our allegiances to them, and that's what happened in Yemen. That's what they wanted to happen in Syria. They thought that the majority Sunni army would simply defect to the side of the Free Syrian Army it was originally under Riyad al-Assad.
Yep.
I don't know if you remember
His
him.
father.
Yeah, and then Salim Idris took over after that. And that they would simply be loyal to these two guys, and then the Syrian National Coalition, which is based in Turkey, they would then fly in and become the new parliament, and they change the flag, change the constitution, and allow the Muslim Brotherhood to contest elections. That's what they expected to happen, but it didn't happen that way.
So why is it that the Syrian revolution is not considered a genuine revolution?
I think it's a world war. I mean, look at it this way. If you look at the First World War, you look at all the powers that are involved in it, all of those same powers are now involved in the Syrian conflict with the exception of Japan.
So you just mentioned those nations. So now you mentioned earlier that there was an alliance between the Syrians, the Iranians, the Iraqis, and the Lebanese. You also have Russia and China on their side because they have common interest and a common enemy as well. So what role did these external forces play, as well as America and Britain and the Gulf nations? What role did they play in this war?
A defensive role. So you have to differentiate between Russia and Iran in this instance, because they're playing a defensive role. They're trying to prevent the overthrow of the Syrian government by the forces that are attempting it, who are instigating the conflict. Whereas the United States is playing a destabilizing role. They're playing an offensive role. And that's the big difference, I think.
Okay. And the Arab Spring, it was prior to the let's say war in Syria, very, very close together. So what role did the Arab Spring play in the Syrian war or the conflict?
The Arab Spring created the climate for the Syrian war. But the general template for the Arab Spring was that Muslim political parties would campaign for democratic elections, and then they would come to power that way. That was the model, the template. And the discourse that came with the Arab Spring was, on the one hand, you had people saying, isn't it good that Muslims are disproving Western myths about the Middle East, that the Middle East can't be democratic, that Muslims can't be democratic. So that was like the climate of the Arab Spring. But there's a huge difference between the Arab Spring as it happened in Tunisia and Egypt and the Arab Spring, or so-called Arab Spring, as it happened in Syria. So in Tunisia and Egypt, you'll notice that the Arab Spring was focused on the main urban centers. So Tunis, Cairo, Alexandria, all the major centers had Arab Spring protests, and they're urban centers. And for the Arab Spring to spread from Tunisia to Egypt, it took like less than 48 hours.
Yep.
It was a very rapid kind of thing. Syria, it took about 3 or 4 months, and the Arab Spring protests did not happen in the major urban centers. There were some protests, but they were very small in Damascus. And in Aleppo, they were almost non-existent. But to the extent that there was a so-called Arab Spring in Syria, it began on the border regions. It began in Jordan, and it began in Idlib in the very north. And so these are border regions that they border Jordan, which is a US ally, and they also border Turkey, which is part of NATO.
Yeah.
So this should tell you something, that there's something different about about what's happening in Syria. And this was first brought to my attention by an Indian political analyst named Prem Shankar Jha. And he wrote about this. And he said, yeah, like it's happening on the borders. And the other thing he mentioned, which was interesting, and it's funny that this never gets mentioned, one of the early grievances of the protests in Daraa was that they wanted the government to get rid of security laws that prevented people who lived on the border areas from easily selling their land. Okay. So previously, actually the law still exists. If you live on the border with Jordan, and if you want to sell your land, you have to get clearances and permission from the Syrian government. This is very suspicious because the Syrian government has genuine security reasons for why it doesn't want its borders to be controlled by anyone. Definitely. What if you sell it to someone who puts it in the names of different front companies and they're laundering money and they're creating cells and whatnot to then launch an uprising against the government? This is a very suspicious demand.
So you suggesting that the so-called Arab Spring in Syria was driven by outside influences and not the legitimate Arab Spring that we saw in, for example, Egypt?
Syria, even before this so-called Arab Spring, had a long history of reforms, and these are known in Syria as Bashar al-Assad's liberalizing reforms. They're appreciated by the urban middle class. They are not as appreciated by the rural populations. But then again, there's multiple factors here, so there's a global economic crisis which affects everyone. Food prices go up. But Syria is kind of insulated from that because it's got some self-sufficiency in agriculture. But at the same time, Syria's got other economic problems, like its oil. Oil was like running out, so they weren't able to pump out as much as they did in the past, and that hurt their budget bottom line. So there's all kinds of other reasons why people would have genuine grievances against the government. But this is what imperialism does. Like, even if you take a country like Syria, I think it's always worth mentioning that it punched above its weight in terms of its income level. So a country like Qatar has a per capita income of like $120,000 or something. It's really high. Yep. Syria, before the war, had a per capita income measured in US dollars at like $3,000 or $4,000. It's not much. Right. But in terms of life expectancy, it was pretty much on par with Qatar. And 90% of the pharmaceuticals in Syria were domestically produced. This is a very self-sufficient country. And like I said before, this is one of its achievements. And so this also explains why the same kind of mass protests that you saw in Egypt, you didn't see in Syria. But then what the way the media spins it is they say, well, if there's mass protests against the government, that's because the government's oppressive. If there's no protests against the government, that's also because the government's oppressive, because people are too scared to go out and protest. So you can't win.
So the media tells us that the Syrian government responded to these peaceful protests with extreme force, and this is what sparked the war. So what's your perspective on that?
The first report of this happening comes from Reuters. This was either in March or April 2011. And they reported that 37 civilians had been gunned down by security forces. There's a problem with this. Even in their own article, they only mentioned, later on they mentioned 13 people had been taken to the hospital and these were the civilians that had been treated. Well, what about the others, right? There's another the rest of that number. Well, later on we found out through the great reporting of Sharmin Narwani, shout out to you, that 24 of that 37 were actually Syrian government soldiers. So the majority of people who were killed in that particular incident were Syrian government soldiers. So what happens in a typical, let's say, when these early confrontations happened, what would happen is, let's say 30 people died, yep. Right? They would say something like, 15 civilians have been killed and 15 government soldiers have been killed. Now, there's a problem with that. Who killed the government soldiers, right? Was it the civilians that killed them?
Or other government soldiers?
Yeah, so here's where you get to the part of it that's actually, there's some truth to the claims that civilians were making, that they were being targeted by the government. Snipers on the rooftops, right? So there's video footage of this, right, where they show plainclothes people standing on the tops of the rooftops, basically just sniping at civilians. And then what would happen is that these martyrs, right, would then be be the rallying call at Friday prayer, and then this would generate more publicity, and then this would happen. This happened on a few occasions. Now, nobody knows who they were. To this day, we don't know. Now, obviously, the people who oppose the Syrian government are going to say, oh, the Syrian government did this. But why would they do this? The narrative, unfortunately, up until mid-2012, was that the Syrian government is just murdering peaceful protesters. There was no acknowledgement by all of the talking heads and the political analysts that supported the overthrow of the Syrian state that there was actually an armed insurgency waging war against the government. That armed insurgency began on the 17th of March 2011, right? When around 11 people were killed, and oh man, I've forgotten the figures because it was so long ago. I was so focused on Israel, but basically, yeah, I'll find it for you. But basically, police were killed along with civilians.
Okay,
right? The number doesn't matter. Police were killed along with civilians, right? And this suggests that there was an armed war against the state brewing from March 2011.
So this war against the state, was it politically fueled, or was it fueled again by outside interests?
There is a political element to it, which is that the Muslim Brotherhood is banned in Syria. So it's illegal. And so naturally, yeah, if you have Islamic politics that are of the Muslim Brotherhood variety and you believe that it's your democratic right, then you should be raising that as a demand. But what's surprising is that it was never raised as a demand. The only demand was that the Syrian government should leave office. So on the one hand, they're saying we want democracy, but on the other hand, they're saying that the entire Syrian state apparatus should surrender to them. Surrender to who exactly? A bunch of unelected people in Turkey is basically what this... Does that sound democratic to you? Of course, then they'd say, well, we'd have a transitional government, we'd draft a new constitution, etc., etc. That is, if Syria doesn't fall into another civil war after the Syrian government's overthrown. That's usually what happened. That's what happened in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, from throughout the 1980s, as you know, there was a Saudi, CIA, Pakistani-backed attempt to overthrow the government. They were ultimately successful in 1992. It resulted in a civil war that resulted in the complete destruction of Kabul, the capital city. And so that's... If it was possible for us to look into an alternate timeline where the Syrian government actually did collapse, that's probably what would have happened.
So what is it that allowed the Syrian government to remain and not be toppled? What were their strengths against these insurgents, the powers on the outside, and everything else that was going on with them?
I think it's the fact that the Syrian government, the way that it ran its economy, it focused on self-sufficiency. It was never anywhere near as neoliberal as the other Arab countries, particularly Egypt. Egypt relied on imports, was heavily import dependent. So when the global food crisis happened after the global financial crisis, Egypt was hit pretty hard by that. So yeah, I think self-sufficiency makes a huge difference.
So was that self-sufficiency a defining factor in the US and Israel and those other Gulf nations getting involved in the conflict?
I think so, because I think they see Syria as a hard state, because you can't be a resistant state and also be a liberal democracy at the same time. Because if you believe that the existence of your state is threatened by an aggressive colonizing entity like Israel, and by the United States, by Turkey, which is the former colonial power before France, and also by the Gulf powers, because in the history of during the Cold War, the main conflict within the Arab world was between republics and monarchies, and Syria was a very proud republic.
Yep.
So if you believe that's your neighborhood, it's very difficult to become a liberal democracy and be completely open when you have so much external pressure against you. And I think Syrians understand that. So you have a kind of contradiction within Syrian society. The people that care about corruption don't really care about democracy, and the people who care about democracy don't really care about corruption.
Don't care about corruption.
Because if you believe that the fundamental problem with your country is that there's too much corruption, you're going to want more power at the executive level. Because imagine a hierarchy in a society where you've got a high, a middle, and a low. High is the top branches of government, the top brass, the military, the top business leaders, whatever. The middle is, the middle class, whatever. And then you've got the low, which is the working class and the peasantry. Then the way that like a one-party state or like or an ideologically partisan state with like a vanguard party like the Ba'ath Party, the way that it's supposed to function is that the high is supposed to collaborate with the low to keep the middle in check, which is where all the corruption is. That's the way it's supposed to function. And so people don't get these dynamics. You know, you can't just cleanly divide the world into democracies and dictatorships. It doesn't work that way. The world is complicated, right? So, yeah, I mean, the people who want democracy, on the other hand, I mean, I can understand where they're coming from as well, because they, well, understand purely in the sense that, like, you know, I realize where their class interests lie, because if you look at like what they were arguing for, you know, they wanted, you know, Syria to become even more neoliberal than what it is today.
So what hand do the nations surrounding Syria have in this? So the so-called alliance between Syria, Lebanon, Iraq and Iran, what hand do the other three nations have in this conflict?
Iraq and Syria have been fighting more or less the same conflict. I mean, Iraq got dragged into it in 2013 when there was a large prison break and ISIS came to the scene in Mosul and declared that to be their de facto capital. So, yeah, Iraq has been fighting on one front with the Iraqi militias in particular doing a lot of the fighting, because, you know, the Iraqi army was not reliable. That's what happened, because when Islamic State came onto the scene in the western parts of Iraq, the Sunni parts of Iraq, I mean, there's no other way of putting it, then, yeah, the Iraqi army was not willing to take them on. And so the task of defending the government fell to the Iraqi militias, the Shia militias. By the way, I mean, there's Sunnis that have fought with Hashd al-Sha'bi as well.
So the militias in Iraq, especially Hashd al-Sha'bi, it comprises of majority Shia, but it also includes a lot of Sunnis, Christians as well, and Yazidis. Or as I mentioned, as Yazidis. So when they went to fight in Mosul, most of the frontliners were Yazidis.
Yeah. And I think one of the big differences here is that there's a huge strategic difference between the way that groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State see themselves functioning and the way that Shia groups function. Shia groups are happy to work within the parameters of the Arab nationalist Republican state. And so, I mean, so for example, Sistani, did he demand a theocracy? Did he demand Vilayat al-Faqih? No, he didn't. He said, we want a Republican, democratic system of governance. And that's ultimately what happened. So similarly in Hezbollah, did Hezbollah impose Vilayat al-Faqih? No. They're working with the system. I mean, there's a lot of anger at them for like working, you know, too closely and not being bold enough to assert their own independent political agenda. So yeah, I mean that's like a huge difference, I think. Whereas with the Al-Qaeda and Islamic State groups, they see the entire Arab nationalist Republican project as being almost un-Islamic and dirty and disgusting. You have to get rid of it and you have to replace it either with an emirate or a caliphate.
Yeah. So was the introduction of ISIS and Al-Qaeda into Iraq and Syria, was that the almost like Hail Mary from the outside powers?
Yeah, because I think what happened is that initially they tried to rely on defectors from the Syrian army, but the defectors, like I think they numbered, this is according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights again, like the reason I quote this is because Tim Anderson, he makes this argument that it's always good to use admissions against interest.
Yeah.
Because it's against the interests of the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights to tell you that there were only 2,000 defectors from the Syrian Arab army.
Definitely.
Very small. They have an interest in inflating the number, but they don't. They say 2,000. So that's what they did. Then you have like the Free Syrian Army, and the problem with them is that there was a lot of corruption. Like the thing is, there was a period when every month there was a new bunch of groups. If you look at the list of groups that are Free Syrian Army brigades or even other Islamic brigades, there's like 20, 30, 40, 50 of them, right? And the reason I think for this is because of the suppliers of arms. So, you know, the Free Syrian Army ended up becoming middlemen in the supplying of arms, because what would you rather be? I mean, would you rather risk your life on the front line against the Syrian army? They've got armor, artillery, air power. Or would you rather be a middleman, you know, who who gets the weapons from Turkey and then gives it to people who are willing to fight.
Yeah.
Who is willing to fight? Who's actually ideologically committed? Jabhat al-Nusra. Jabhat al-Nusra, I mean, this is the thing. The funniest thing about the Syrian conflict is that this group is referred to as the moderate rebels.
Okay.
Right? So this is something that James Clapper, he was the head of the CIA, he said this. He said that any group that is an Islamic State, we're going to call them moderate rebels. So that includes Jabhat al-Nusra. But what is Jabhat al-Nusra? Today, it's known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which used to be known as Jabhat Fateh al-Sham, which used to be known as Jabhat al-Nusra. And its leader, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, he was sent to Syria by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi.
Okay.
Because they were a member of the same organization.
Yep.
It used to be known as the Islamic State of Iraq. And then it became Islamic State of Iraq and Syria because there was a split between the two. And this is a huge split. I mean, we don't really recognize these splits because we look at it from the perspective of the Syrian government and the Syrian people. But the split was because ISIS says that we can declare a caliphate now, whereas Jabhat al-Nusra said we can only even think about declaring a caliphate once we've overthrown the pre-existing government. That's what the split was over.
So the basically those insurgents or the little militias that were fighting, like the FSA, Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS, and all their other militias that formed out of that, were they funded by those from the militias or from the outside as well? Because it would make no sense for the Syria to fund themselves against themselves.
Well, this is one of the claims that started to emerge, and you started to see it when Islamic State came onto the scene. So Islamic State split from Jabhat al-Nusra in April 2013. Now, around that time, what you started to notice was that a lot of, let's now divide the forces waging war against the Syrian state into two camps. Islamic State and let's just call them ironically the moderate rebels. That's the label that's been given to them. But I think it's more accurate to call them Jabhat al-Nusra and the Free Syrian Army. But let's just call them moderate because it's funny. It also because it ties it to the CIA's propaganda, right? So what happened is that the moderates, they started accusing the Syrian government of supporting ISIS because it makes sense. They've had a split, right? Jabhat al-Nusra has split from ISIS. They used to be the same organization. Yep. And now the moderates are basically saying that ISIS is the responsibility of the Syrian government. And the argument that they started to promote to the Western media is that the Syrian government released prisoners who then swelled the ranks of Islamic State. There's a problem with this. If you look at the names of the prisoners, like the people for whom we have names, right? Because obviously there were prison releases back in 2011 because that's what the people who were against the Syrian government were demanding. Yep. Everyone who was out there in Sydney, whatever, protesting against the Syrian government, they were saying the Syrian government should release political prisoners, and the imagination that we have is that, okay, maybe they're like the Amnesty International of Syria, these poor oppressed. No, the people who were released by the Syrian government include Zahran Aloush and Hassan Aboud. And these two ended up being in charge of Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham respectively.
Wow.
So the point, and the reason I mention this is because these are moderate, these are the so-called moderate brigades. So I did a count, like I posted this somewhere else as well. Like I counted about 7 people who became prominent figures among the insurgency, who certainly were released by the Syrian government. I think the people in Syria consider that to be a huge mistake in hindsight. They thought if you make this concession, they're going to calm down, whatever, right? They weren't expecting this level of opposition. I mean, this level of military opposition, rather, not really opposition. But like of the 7 people who we know who became prominent names among the insurgency, the majority of them are actually part of the moderate rebel camp, right? So this argument that the Syrian government is releasing people who then became Islamic State in order to make the revolution look bad, which is basically the argument that they were making. Yeah. Like we were making the argument back in 2012, 2013, that from the very beginning, the forces waging war against the Syrian state were Wahhabi extremists, and people were saying, no, you're being Orientalist, you're being Islamophobic, blah blah blah. You're hearing people screaming Allahu Akbar and thinking that they're gonna kill everyone because you have because you're like George Bush and you hate Muslims, something stupid like that, right? But then we ended up being vindicated, and when we were vindicated, there had to be an excuse, and the excuse was that the Syrian government released these people to make this to make the revolution look bad and to discredit the so-called revolution.
So what did the FSA and Jabhat al-Nusra seek to gain by opposing the ideology of ISIS and having their own view of a caliphate?
It's purely about the power relations and control over oil resources, because Jabhat al-Nusra in northern Syria, the parts of Syria that are now controlled by the YPG and occupied by the United States, they took over all of Syria's oil resources, and they were making a lot of money. And they were selling the oil via Iraqi Kurdistan. They were selling it to Turkey, so Bilal Erdogan, the son of the current president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, was directly involved in selling this, he was buying oil that was stolen by ISIS. And a lot of this oil, actually, a lot of it actually ended up being bought by Israel as well. There's an article in Zero Hedge about that called Raqqa's Rockefellers. You should check that out.
Definitely.
So this is a way of kind of this is how ISIS funded itself. And so because it had this gigantic independent source of revenue, it basically said to all of the other militias fighting the Syrian government, you should now subordinate yourself to us and give bay'ah to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And then Raqqa became the de facto capital of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria.
So the nations of Israel and the US assisting the funding of countries like assisting the funding of the militias of ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, was that to push their influence on the Syrian government?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the way it happened, I think is that in Turkey and Jordan they set up training camps, and it was open for people from all over the world who wanted to fight the Syrian government. You name it, like Eskimos who convert to Wahhabism can come and fight the Syrian government, no problems. Because, by the way, just like to make a side point, this is one of the kind of weaknesses of Syria, which is that it has such a prominent place in Islamic history because it's the capital of the great Umayyad Empire, right, which is one of the world's largest empires.
The Levant, yeah.
Which means that when you have like Muslims, particularly Sunnis from all over the world, who they have a sense of entitlement that they have a right to have a say over what happens in Syria.
So essentially the same reasoning of Israel going into Palestine.
Actually, that's a very good comparison. I have thought about that before. Yeah, I don't see any difference between a British Pakistani going from London to Syria, a country in which they have no ancestral connection, and saying, this belongs to me because I belong to an ideology, which is basically a bunch of stuff in your head, because my ideology says that this belongs to the Muslims. It's exactly the same as the Zionist justification for the existence.
So could that have been a reason for the support of the Israelis, as in using that as propaganda?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I mean, the Israelis don't publicly admit any of
No,
this stuff.
definitely.
And they don't get accused of it either, right? But think about the evidence that we have. I mean, from 2013 onwards, Israel has been knocking out Syria's anti-aircraft systems. And this just continued and continued. Then it ramped up to a fever pitch in 2018. They launched like 2,000 airstrikes, not just against the Syrian Arab Army, but against Hezbollah, against Iran. Originally they were targeting Hezbollah and Iran. Then they started to target the Syrian Arab Army as well. And the thing is, they were trying to knock out Syria's ability to defend its own airspace. And then once you do that, then the Israeli planes can fly all over the place.
And then just do what they want.
Before 2011, was Israel flying over Lebanon all the time? No,
not
they
at all.
weren't. I mean, it's something that's been made possible because the stability of Syria has been weakened. Syria has so much on its plate that Lebanon can't defend its airspace, and the Lebanese army refuses to use. I don't know if they have anti-aircraft defenses or not. But, I mean, that's one thing. The other thing is that in 2016, Syrian Arab Army released photos showing Israeli markings in Hebrew on ammunition boxes. We have photos of Benjamin Netanyahu shaking hands with soldiers who were injured fighting against the Syrian government. Now, who does Israel think they're helping in Syria. When they're helping people who are fighting the Syrian government, who do they think they are? According to Avigdor Lieberman, who's Israel's defense minister, this is back in July 2017, he said, "The rebels are not our friends, they are all versions of Al-Qaeda." He said that. So the Israelis know who they're supporting.
So essentially they're admitting their support for these militia groups.
Precisely, to break the Shiite crescent.
So now Israel's hand in Syria is very prominent.
Yeah.
It's very clear and very obvious. Are they, and countries like the US and the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, are they looking to knock Syria out of the picture and then just basically have somewhere to establish so that they have a free range at countries like Iraq, Iran?
I mean, if you go back to the Oded Yunon plan, they specifically talk about the Kurds, about balkanizing Syria and Iraq to make way for Kurdish entities. So in many ways, if you look at the US intervention against Islamic State, the way that a lot of the people who support the overthrow of the Syrian government would present that, including a lot of Sunnis, would be to say that this proves that the United States is not interested in fighting Assad, because instead of fighting the Assad government, they're launching airstrikes against Islamic State. Okay, but look at the geography, and this is what they never do. The purpose of the US aerial war against Islamic State was on behalf of the Kurds.
Okay.
Right? Because the Kurds, they had a de facto agreement with the Syrian government after 2013, because they had a common interest, which is that the Kurds have an interest in preventing the borders from being infiltrated by foreign fighters who are going to fight against the Syrian government, because they know they're backed by Turkey and the Kurds don't like Turkey.
That's right.
And historically, the Syrian government supported the PKK. They supported the PKK from 1980 all the way through to 1998. In fact, the PKK was headquartered in Damascus. Abdullah Öcalan lived in Damascus. And so if you listen to Zahran Aloush, for example, like his invectives against the PKK and against the YPG are quite clear. He says the PKK was created by Hafiz al-Assad. That's a direct quote from Zahran Aloush. He was killed in 2015, by the way, but before that. By the way, he's also responsible for throwing civilians in cages and parading them around and using them as human shields. And he's also called for Syria to be cleansed of the Rafida. So these are the moderate forces in Syria. In many ways, their rhetoric is no different from Islamic State.
Not at all. So
to move to Islamic State and the US intervention against them, the US was basically using what I call cattle prod bombing.
Yep.
So they're basically saying to Islamic State, if you fight against the Kurds, we're going to fight you. Because, it's like, for example, bullies in high school.
Yeah.
It's like, if you pick on my little brother, I'm going to fight you.
Yeah.
So that's what the Americans said effectively were sending that message to Islamic State, saying, if you fight the Kurds, we're going to fight you. So they pushed back Islamic State, but then what did Islamic State do? They decided to direct all of their aggression against the Syrian government. So in the first year of the US intervention, so the US intervened in September 2014. From September 2014 to September 2015, the Syrian government lost territory, which is what provoked the Russian intervention. Okay. So the Russian intervention was because the Syrian government was losing all of this territory to Islamic State. They weren't that far from Damascus. That's when the Russians intervened.
Okay, so the American bombing, was that a diversion to divert ISIS back into like Syria and fight in there? Don't worry about these guys. Fight in there.
Yeah, fight the Syrian
push our agenda.
Exactly, yeah.
And leave these guys alone because we like them.
Yeah, exactly. So they played Islamic State. So before 2014, which is when a lot of socialists, anarchists, and leftists, liberals, whatever, that's when they discovered that Kurds even existed. It became a cause célèbre. It's like, the Kurds, the dancing feminist, eco-friendly, whatever, like democratic socialist, whatever, right? Like they read Murray Bookchin, who's this American anarchist. But before that, what was happening is that, when Syria controlled those territories that had the oil, they were sanctioned by the European Union. Within a month of Islamic State taking control of those oil resources, the sanctions on Syria were lifted. right? Thereby allowing ISIS to fund itself via the theft and trade
oil.
of Syria's natural resources.
So what strategic objectives were they trying to achieve? Nations like the European nations and the US and Israel, by pushing this agenda?
Before the Arab Spring, George Friedman, he's the founder of Stratfor. It's a strategic force. It's been referred to as a kind of shadow CIA. So they echo the opinions of intelligence agencies. And he said the strategy of the United States should be one of destabilizing Eurasia. So I think it's just, they want to create failed states, especially in the Arab world. It would make Israel a lot more, it's like killing two birds with one stone. It's a way of mitigating the problem of declining US hegemony, and also it helps Israel in the process.
So you mentioned the intervention of Russia later on, and people say that there are multiple imperialist powers.
Yeah.
For example, Russia and Iran. How would you respond to that?
Russia and Iran have played a defensive role, whereas the United States has played an offensive destabilizing role. But let's look at the word imperialism. Where does it come from? So this is a part of my PhD. The word imperialism, as it's popularized, because it's really the Marxists that popularized the term imperialism, comes from Lenin. But Lenin got his concept of imperialism from John Hobson, by the way. So I'm not ignorant about that, but let's just talk about Lenin. He was talking about the World War I situation in which there were multiple empires. You had, Britain, France, Russia. You had Turkey. Germany on the other side, alongside Turkey, which was the Ottoman Empire, as well as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So you had multiple, Japan as well, you had multiple empires, and they were all fighting each other for the right to conquer and colonize different parts of the world. Now, it's in that context that the idea of inter-imperialist war makes sense. In that context, it makes sense. Yeah, there's multiple imperialist powers, and there's really no difference between, Germany and Britain, because they both want to exploit and subjugate other parts of the world. Like if Germany got control over India, they would just continue doing what the British were doing. So that is inter-imperialist conflict. But the thing is, Lenin came up with the concept of imperialism in order to capture the geopolitical realities of his time. Now, the problem is that a lot of Marxists have not tried to capture the geopolitical realities as they unfolded after the Second World War, because the world changed drastically after the Second World War. What happened? If you look at the Soviet Union, one of the untold stories of the Soviet Union, one of the inspiring histories about the Soviet Union, is the role that it played in undermining colonialism. This is a huge difference between the Soviet Union and the other imperial powers.
So can you expand on that?
I will. I'm happy to expand on it. So after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet Union made it a part of their state ideology that they supported national liberation struggles against colonial rule. 1/6 of the world's population in India, which is the country I was born in, was living under British imperial rule.
That's right.
Okay? Large swathes of Africa were under European colonial rule. The French, the Belgians were the worst, right? They were the absolute worst. China, all of its ports were occupied by 8 European powers. 8 European powers plus Japan as well. And so this was the geopolitical situation that we're talking about. Now, the Bolsheviks, they represented, in my opinion, a defection in the sense that they weren't like the other empires, because the Soviet Union is also inherits the history of the Russian Empire. But it was also very different from the Russian Empire, because the Russian Empire tried to Russify the populations that they had conquered, whereas the Soviet Union tried to create a multinational framework, to the point where when the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991, they had a vote where they put it to all of the different republics, do you want to keep the Union as like a geopolitical entity? And it was the nations that were historically conquered by the Russian Empire that voted in the highest numbers to keep the Soviet Union, because they benefited for the first time. They were getting investment, their living standards. There was an evening in the past. The Russian Empire benefited the Russians at the expense of everyone else.
And just exploited those nations.
Yeah, and then what the Soviet Union did was they transferred capital from the rich areas to the poor areas. So there was an evening between European Russia and Asiatic Russia. Stalin himself was not Russian, he was Georgian. But anyway, this is getting, I'm digressing. But, on the topic of Stalin, there's one quote where he says, you know, Bolshevism came to tear down the wall between black and white,
Wow.
between Europe and Asia. And this alarmed the European powers. In fact, before the Nazis, there was an American thinker, his name's Lothrop Stoddard, and he wrote about why, he basically explained why the United States should be anti-communist. He said the communists are inciting the inferior races, you know, the brown, the black, the yellow, in rebellion against the superior white race. And that's why they hated the Soviet Union. Well, that's why I like the Soviet Union, right?
Definitely.
Even if you're not communist, even if you dislike Marxism, even if you don't like Stalin or Lenin,
their ideologies, they support the poor man.
Exactly.
Essentially.
Look at what happened in the Middle East, right? All of the republics, right? Who armed them, right? Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Algeria, Libya. All of these countries were armed by the Soviet Union. South Yemen, North Yemen, Soviet Union supported them. Nobody else was willing to give them weapons. Like, the United States was not willing to give North Yemen weapons. The Soviet Union played the role of a counter-hegemon. These countries it was never in the plans of the United States for these countries, these Arab republics, to be independent. The monarchies could be independent because they had lots of oil, so
lots
they could
of money
be given
and lots
free
of oil,
reign, right?
yeah.
But the Arab republics, they were able to assert their independence because of Soviet support. So this changes the entire dynamic of what imperialism is. After the Second World War, to express it succinctly, there were three camps. You had the former empires. You had a US-led alliance of former empires, and their geostrategy was determined to maintain the economic advantages that were won by all of the former European colonial powers against the nations that they had formerly subjugated. That was their geostrategy, and it continues to this day. Then you had a country like the Soviet Union, which represents a defection. This is a former empire that first decolonizes internally. Obviously, it's not perfect, etc. You have to make those allowances. It decolonizes internally, and then it defects its geopolitical loyalties to the third world, to the post-colonial world that was previously exploited. So India, for example, my dad he's not a communist, but he appreciates the fact that the Soviet technical assistance played a huge role in helping India industrialize.
So is this ideology still implemented by the Russians today in conflicts like Syria?
Exactly. Even though Russia's ideology is radically different, like there's Putin does not like Lenin. Putin considers Lenin to be a traitor.
Yep.
So I'm not saying he's a communist or anything like that. But the thing is, the modern Russian state has inherited the geostrategy of the Soviet Union, which is to support the republics. And they're going to continue doing that. So they're performing the same role effectively, which is as a counter-hegemon. And
what support is that showing in the Syrian conflict?
It's military. I mean, people think that imperialism is basically any state that acts violently beyond its borders is by definition imperialist. Well, the problem is that you're stripping away from the concept of imperialism the reality of national exploitation. So what does British imperialism, because before the United States, Britain was the hegemon for 100 years. What was the financial basis for British hegemony? It was the fact that they had 1/6 of the world's population, India, subjugated, and from India they were able to extract $45 trillion. That's how much it's been estimated by. The United States, after Britain, did not have the same foundations for its currency hegemony because the United States was faced with a decolonizing world because all these post-colonial nations are being armed to the teeth by the Soviet Union, so the cost of reconquering them is much higher. You're going to have to pay in because all of these people who previously had no weapons suddenly have modern tanks because of the Soviet Union. This is a counter-hegemonic force in world history. And so for that reason, the accusation that the Soviet Union is imperialist is so disingenuous. There's no value transfer. That Russia has never exploited Syria.
So what impact is that support showing in Syria?
The impact is that, they've helped them win the war. Effectively, it's hurt Russia a lot. But then Russia also knows that if they don't do anything in the short term, then in the long term, it's going to hurt them. So, for example, take Libya. Russia did not do anything. Right, that was under Medvedev. He was president. It was his call. It wasn't Putin. They decided to sit back, and Libya fell. And what happened? The entire Soviet army, like stockpiles of the Libyan army, ended up being transferred by the CIA, by MI6. This is written about by Seymour Hersh, by the way, very respected journalist. He wrote an article called Red Lines and Rat Lines, and basically, the Libyan army stockpiles were shipped to Turkey, where they were distributed amongst the Free Syrian Army. So the failure of Russia to intervene in Libya actually made the problem worse in the context of Syria.
So what does that say about Russia's role now in the long term of the Syrian conflict?
I think it means that like Russia will have a permanent role there because it doesn't want to lose its position, because if it had abandoned Syria, it may have been able to keep its naval base, who knows, or it may have been kicked out. Because there's also competition between Turkey and Russia, because these are two very old rivals. Turkey, Iran, and Russia, they go back, think about the Ottoman Safavid wars, for example, from the 1500s, right? Think about the Russo-Turkish wars, which began in 1566 with I think it was Ivan the Terrible. He invaded Astrakhan, which was previously, Turkic. So there was historic Russian aggression, against areas. That's all true. If you look at this history, there are competing rivalries that aren't the United States. So even if the United States were to leave the scene, there would still be Turkey. And what's Turkey's interest? Now, a lot of the reason why you saw this huge upsurge in Sunni identity politics in Western countries because of Turkey. Because Turkey started presenting itself as an alternative to Saudi Arabia, because everyone hates Saudi Arabia, right? Like most Sunnis do not like Saudi Arabia. Like don't think that I think that there are Sunnis out there who are fawning over how great Saudi Arabia is. Nobody likes that country. In 1979, Sunnis tried to overthrow the Saudi government.
That's right. Yeah.
So it's a regime that's completely despised. Turkey, however, has some historic cred to it, because Turkey is the successor state to the former Ottoman Empire. So this idea of the Arab Spring being a kind of neo-Ottoman revival was a huge theme in the Arab Spring. It can't be denied, because in many ways, what was World War I about from an Arab point of view? The Ottoman Empire had lost its credibility. The Arabs weren't willing to fight and die for the Ottoman Empire.
Definitely.
Basically, that's what happened. More Arabs were willing to take up arms against it. And so the Ottoman Empire lost its Arab territory. So that was the original Arab Spring. It was the rolling back of the Ottoman Empire. The Arab Spring of 2011 is the other way around. It's an attempt by Turkey to regain its former spheres of influence. But this is, I think, the part that's a little bit contradictory, because Turkey and Qatar, say what you will about them, they had a long-term plan for stability in these countries. The flag would change, the Muslim Brotherhood would come into power, it would become more Islamic. It wouldn't be very good for the Alawites. There would be foundational massacres for this state to be formed, So Alawites and the Druze would cop it, Shiites would, Christians, their role in the state and their loyalty would be questioned. All of that stuff would happen, right? But the end goal for Qatar and Turkey was one of, let's try and create a stable Muslim Brotherhood government. Let's try and, create our own sphere of influence. Whereas the United States, Israel, they want pure destruction. Saudi Arabia as well, I believe, just wants pure destruction, because of all the Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia is the one that's like just completely beholden to the United States.
So in Syria's current situation, is there an end to the US influence against the Syrian government? And other nations surrounding Syria and the nations supporting the Syrian government, such as Iran and Lebanon, are they equipped to hold off this wave of US influence and Israeli influence, Saudi influence, and restabilize the nation?
The problem, the US influence has changed a little bit. So when Donald Trump came to power, you may remember this, that in his campaign speeches before he became president, he was actually excuse me, he was actually pushing for isolationism. So he was saying, you know, the United States shouldn't be involved in these wars, and he was praising Russia's, you know, obliteration of Islamic State as well. But then once he came to power, you know, I think you realize that US geostrategy can't be changed even if the president wants to, and if the president wants to be re-elected, then he has to make some compromises. So, for example, in exchange for pursuing the trade war with China, I think he's continued to enact pressure on Syria. So this year there was the Caesar sanctions, which were even more crippling sanctions on Syria, which is why the currency is depreciated. It's a good thing that Syria has self-sufficient agriculture. Yeah. But as for Lebanon, because you also mentioned, now we're seeing this, we've seen a kind of color revolution situation in Lebanon. Because if you look at Lebanon's financial problems, a lot of it is deeply structural. You know, so you have a country that has, you know, a peg of 1,507 lira to the dollar, which is a way of incentivizing investment. So you say to investors, if you come in, you can take your money out at the same rate. You're not going to face depreciation risk. But the problem is that eventually it became a kind of Ponzi scheme. Lebanon needed to borrow money just to consume. So Lebanon ended up adopting similar policies to the United States. The difference is that the United States has the dollar hegemony, not Lebanon, which means that there's been a lot of capital flight from Lebanon. It's been estimated at, get this, $50 billion over the 2 quarters. So from the last quarter of 2019, the first quarter of this year, $50 billion left Lebanon, and most likely it ended up in the Anglo-American financial empire. And the reason why this is allowed to continue is because the United States, I mean, you know, Lebanon is so deeply fractured. I mean, it's a country in which the fundamental questions of the civil war were never actually resolved. Yeah. They were only suppressed. The Lebanese civil war was about what? Is Lebanon a Western country, or is it an enclave that's pro-Western, or is it an Arab nation? That was basically what the question was, but that was never really resolved. Instead, you ended up with a compromise equilibrium.
Swept under the rug.
I mean, you know, Hezbollah, if you can criticize them for anything, you can criticize them for being too nice. After the Israelis were forced to withdraw because of the resistance, what happened? I mean, a lot of people who had previously collaborated with Israel, not a hair on their head was touched.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like incredibly generous. I mean, I know that if communists were in charge of Lebanon, the Lebanese resistance, there'd probably be a bloodbath.
Yeah, definitely.
But, you know, this is the thing about, like, you know, your ideology. It's very forgiving. You know, so anyway, to get back to the point, because of the fractured nation of the nature of the Lebanese state, you have, for example, someone like Riyad Salameh, who's the governor of the central bank in Lebanon. And, you know, the US ambassador to Lebanon basically said that it's a red line to challenge his authority over the Lebanese central bank. Because he's the one who's basically opening the floodgates and allowing Lebanon's hard currency foreign exchange reserves to be bled to go overseas. And so all you need to do there is impose some capital controls. Now, here's the thing. After the Beirut blasts, who was the fall guy? Hassan Diab, who was the prime minister, he resigned. Obviously, there was some pressure put on him. He probably feared for his life. I don't know the situation. We'll find out later. But the funny thing is that he was actually trying to mitigate Lebanon's economic problems because he wanted to restructure the debt so Lebanon didn't have to pay back so much. He could pay back in installments. And so the debt was to the IMF, so they got rid of him. But he was like not the problem. Yeah,
he just took the fall.
Yeah, he was not the problem. Like the people who are the problem are being covered up by this slogan in Lebanon, which is kullun yani kullun, which is they're all the same. So now, I mean, obviously, yes, there's corruption. You know, yes, you know, people like Gibran Basil, I believe is his name. That's his name, isn't it?
I think so.
Foreign Minister? Yeah, Gibran Basil, that's right. They have been implicated, you know, and he's from the Free Patriotic Movement. So there is corruption on both sides. There are accusations against
the corruption is very evident.
Yeah. But there is one political party in Lebanon that is not corrupt. In one political party in Lebanon, well, it's also a militia, as you know, Hezbollah, that openly says, you know, if you're going to have investigations into corruption, investigate us first. We're an open book.
That's right.
You know, I mean, obviously there's limits to that. I mean, you know, Michel Aoun, he came out and he said, look, you know, Hezbollah has never used its arms against political opponents inside Lebanon. It's never done that. But its political opponents have tried to undermine Hezbollah in ways that only benefit Israel. So can you imagine 2 years after what was it? 2 years after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006, the opposition in Lebanon, they tried to shut down Hezbollah's internal communication system. And so for a very brief period, Hezbollah took over Beirut just to demonstrate their power, and they backed off, and that way they were able to save their telecommunication system. This is, then they're not a corrupt force.
Is their influence as powerful in Syria as it is, or as it was in Lebanon in the times of the invasion and afterwards?
I mean, the influence was more the other way around. I mean, up until 2006, Hezbollah was spoken of as an Iranian Syrian proxy. So that's how they refer to it. Like I can quote to you, from the Israeli document in 1982. They talk about the nature of the Syrian regime. The Syrian-controlled Bekaa Valley in Lebanon has become for terror what the Silicon Valley has become for computers.
Wow.
This is in 1982. So the Israelis in 1982 are thinking, okay, well, Hezbollah is just a militia. They're like the PLO. They're reliant on foreign donors, foreign support, etc. I think fundamentally they underestimated the amount of organic support that they had among the Lebanese population. I think that's a huge factor.
And just to end, what stance have you taken in your PhD on the Syrian conflict?
The stance that I'm taking is to say that these are world wars. You cannot understand these as civil wars. I mean, that's one of the criticisms that I had, where some of the people who were reviewing my work, they said, why don't you just focus on one country? And I said, I can't. I've looked at the history of imperialism and I've identified 3 major long wave cycles of hegemony, currency hegemony, that have to be looked at and aren't. So, for example, the first cycle of currency hegemony was, and I'll get to Syria at the very end, but you'll be interested to know how this begins. The Portuguese were the first European colonial empire that set off the modern chain of empires, right? Before that, European power goes back to the Roman Empire, right? So, you had a period when the Roman Empire was strong, then you had a long period when Islam was the major hegemon, and then the Portuguese, they were able to establish their supremacy because they found an alternate route to India around Africa. And so when they came to India, they started competing with the Arabs, because the Arabs, they used to be the major traders, the Arabs and the Chinese. Yep. But then, the Chinese became reclusive after a while and they stopped sending out ships and they became more internally focused. But the Arabs were the major traders. Now, one of the major trading ports in the Indian Ocean was in Kerala, where I'm from. So one of the stories is that the Portuguese, they came to Kerala, and this gives you an idea of how poor Europe was, and nobody thought anything of Portugal. Like in Kerala, they didn't know who the Portuguese were, right? They said, okay, we trade with the Arabs, we trade with the Persians, we know who they are, we have a long history of trade, and we get their religion, etc. But the Portuguese, we have no idea who they are. So when the Portuguese came to Kerala, they came with some basic items with which to trade, like some cloth and some really cheap trinkets. And they got laughed out of the court, out of the king's court. This is the Zamarin of Calicut. This is the head of state in Kerala. Because they said, next time, you want to impress the king, you should bring something like gold, because that's what the Arabs bring. That gives you an idea of how poor Portugal was.
So they were a nothing state.
Yeah, they were a nothing state. But what they did was they started to monopolize the trading networks. They used naval power because they had advanced boats. So despite being poor in other ways, they had advanced military technology, and they were willing to die. They were fanatics. They were willing to die because, poverty breeds fanaticism. Europe was a very poor place. And so they were kind of like a Catholic ISIS. So, for example, they sunk a boat full of 300, 500 pilgrims who were Muslims from Kerala, which is the part of India that I'm from. They were traveling to Mecca via boat. They sunk it and they killed the entire population. Oh, sorry, they killed the boat. Yep. They killed the people on the boat, which terrified the population of Kerala. And then this is what led to the Portuguese establishing their naval empire. But the reason I mention this is because it then prompted the Ottomans, who were the major hegemon over the Arabs in that time, to invade Yemen, right? Okay. And so from Kerala's point of view, Yemen's sovereignty became less important than requiring Ottoman assistance against a common enemy, which is the Portuguese.
Portuguese, yeah.
Okay, and then on the other side of the world, the Spanish, they conquered the Americas and they plundered large quantities of gold and silver, and this is what created the conditions for the rise of Europe. All of this gold and silver, like the numbers are astounding. You know, like Adam Smith talks about this as being one of the primary stimulating factors behind the development of Northern Europe. So what happened is that Northern Europe historically did not matter. Northern Europe was the third world of Europe. Southern Europe was where all the wealth is. You think about like all the classical empires, right? Greece, Rome. This is in Southern Europe, right? These are wogs.
Yeah, the
right?
wogs.
They look more like you than they like.
Yeah,
Northern
they look like
Europeans.
Europeans.
Right? I
Yeah,
mean, you probably share a lot of genetic ancestry as well. But then Northern Europe was always poor. I mean, what did the Romans and the Greeks think about the Germans? They saw them as barbarians.
okay.
In fact, the word barbarian comes from the Greek word varvaros, which is a reference to how they thought the Northern Europeans sounded when they spoke.
Wow.
Yeah, so this is what actually resulted in... so what happened is that the Portuguese and the Spanish, they came back with all of this gold, right? Because of the trade networks that they had created and the plundering of the Americas and the taxation in Asia, which is the Portuguese contribution. And they started exporting this to Northern Europe, and in exchange, so Northern Europe started producing in exchange for Spanish and Portuguese gold and silver.
Okay.
This is what resulted in the development of Northern Europe. And eventually Northern Europe subjugated Southern Europe. This is the Peace of Westphalia. And so the ideological contest at that time was between Protestantism, which represents the North, and Catholicism, which represents the pre-hegemonic, preeminent South,
Yeah.
right? Which is like a remnant of the Roman Empire, as you know, the Catholic Church, the Roman Empire. So then from among the Northern European powers, Britain emerges as the leading hegemon in 1757 when they win their first battle on Indian soil, which is the Battle of Plassey, which results in them gradually taking over the entire Indian subcontinent. And from 1757 to 1947, India is plundered 45 trillion. I mentioned that before. And 40 million Indians die in famines, right? This is a genocide.
Yeah.
And so that was the foundation for British currency hegemony. But then the 20th century, the Soviet Union comes on the scene and starts arming all of the people that were previously oppressed
Subjugated, yep.
by the empires. And this undermines the ability for the United States to fashion anything like the hegemony that the British had in the past. So the United States is a declining empire. That's the context of my thesis. And because they are in decline, this is where Syria and the Middle East comes into it. They have to destabilize the Arab world because it's a part of their geostrategy of destabilizing Eurasia in general.
Wow.
That's my PhD in a nutshell.
Sounds like the United States is basically just trying to save themselves from basically collapsing and being subjugated by every other nation.
Yeah, well, they don't have to be subjugated. That's the thing. The problem that the United States has is that its currency is used more as a measure of value rather than as a means of exchange, because people don't hold US dollars primarily to buy US goods. They hold US dollars to buy goods from other countries, and other countries accept it because it's the hegemonic currency. So it's got the inertia of the past. But you see what's been happening over the past 10 years? I mean, back in 2015, Russia started accepting renminbi in exchange for oil. They've started the petro-yuan. China says that they want to expand their debt markets so that foreigners can hold up to 15% of Chinese debt. So if you're an investor, would you rather lend to China or would you rather lend to the United States?
China.
Yeah, China appears like they're good for it because they produce. They're a trade surplus nation, right? The United States has been like a magnet for all of this foreign investment, but it's basically fueled all of these speculative bubbles. Like what happened after the Asian financial crisis? Part of the reason that happened, by the way, is because like a few whales, which is investment language, like a handful of people with large amounts of money, they pull their money out of the Asian economies, and then this led to a rapid depreciation of their currencies. And this is the experience of the entire third world. This is how US currency hegemony continues to uphold the colonial relationship that was established against the third world, which is that the third world is constantly depreciating. Its currency is depreciating against the US dollar. So when that money went back to the United States after leaving Asia during the 97 financial crisis. It pumped up the NASDAQ bubble, the tech bubble as they called it, and that collapsed in 99, 2000. I think it peaked in 2000. And then they decided to get rid of the Glass-Steagall Act, and so that allowed mortgages to be securitized and on-sold. Because the thing is, the US dollar hegemony has to give the rest of the world instruments to invest in, because there's a demand for US dollars.
Yeah.
And the reason there's a demand for US dollars is because instability leads to a demand for US dollars, which is another incentive for destabilizing Eurasia. So this led to the housing bubble, which collapsed in 2008. And then the United States since then has had to smash the debt ceiling twice. So the United States is now the biggest debtor in the world. And this is how imperialism functions. In the past, empires used to go into countries and basically take their money, take their gold, take their raw materials, and then use that to balance their trade deficits. And the debts would not show up in their name. But the United States can't really do that. Instead, they have to borrow. So imagine, instead of a bully saying to you, "Give me your money," the bully says,
"Can I borrow it?
Can I borrow your money?" And it's like a drug addict, right? This drug addict, which is the US financial system. The thing is, so many people in the US, the elites know this. Steve Bannon, like the people who are behind Trump, they know this is the case. Everyone in the United States knows it. But it's like drug addiction in the following sense. A drug addict comes to your house and says, "Look, I need to borrow some money. Can you give it to me?" You're inclined to say no, but then you walk into the driveway, you realize that there's a tank.
Yeah. And then you're like,
"Yeah,
here you go."
yeah." And then the guy says, "Oh, if you don't give it to me, I'm afraid that your house is going to become very unstable."
So it's a form of blackmail in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a very enlightening chat, Jay.
No worries.
Thank you very much for jumping on again. Hopefully we'll have you again soon.